It's wonderful to be back. Roshi said, welcome home, and it always feels that way. I just have such a warm feeling when I see the people I know here and the familiar faces come back to the Zendo, come back to the whole place. So thank you for embracing me, Upaya, all of you. And oh my God, I signed up to do a Dharma talk, and we're also having a coup, which I find very distracting and have been focused on a lot for those of you who have been looking at social media, my social media or the newsletter, and I'm trying to write a book. But I tried to cobble something together for you, and because I meander endlessly without a structure, I do have notes, but I've been instructed by Roshi to not just stare at the page all the time. So I told her I will be the Leonard Bernstein of the Dharma. But really, I'm here to kind of tell you stories, share ideas. There's some kind of Dharma. And speaking of Dharma, when I was sitting before we started, I just thought how great it was to be rooted in a 2,500-year-old practice that has survived emperors, empires, wars, famines, languages, cultures, and continued in the midst of the remarkable destabilization we're now experiencing. So, not that we believe in solid ground exactly, but we do believe in continuity, I think. So, I got to hold a 1-week-old human being Sunday, and it was as magical as ever to meet the ultimate beginner's mind, to be in the presence of our shared humanity when the person in my arms was a reminder that being human can also mean weighing 8 pounds and being before language, before walking, before self-reliance. We often think that being human is like somebody with opinions, a credit card, maybe a driver's license, a tax bill, but it might be being 8 pounds before all that, or being 99 after all that. I think sometimes of those first 2 years in the life of the 8 billion people on earth, of the people, mostly mothers, who give that exacting and incessant care it takes to sustain an 8-pound human being and bring them on. And you add it all up, and there's 16 billion years of early childhood nurture on earth right now, far more than the earth is old, if you just count the first 2 years. And of course, it never really ends with a lot of nurture. The new baby's father talked about the astonishment of the birth. And I joked to him that sometimes I feel like shouting, did you know that human beings come from inside other human beings? That is completely wild, even if it's how every one of us got here. Babies are a reminder how astonishing it all is and who we are beyond our opinions and schedules and obligations, and also that we came from inside someone else, who came from someone inside else, all the way back through evolution to the beginning of this kind of reproduction, that we are connected in time to all our maternal ancestors and this stunning series of Russian dolls, this sort of almost infinite inside, emerging. Someone was ordained in the temple earlier today, and earlier than that, after Zazen, we did the ceremony that's been happening every full moon here since this upaya started. And it put me in mind of when I took the precepts from Blanche Hartman at San Francisco Zen Center in 2010. And when you take the precepts, you get a sort of family tree written down that traces the lineage from Shakyamuni Buddha through all the Indian, Chinese, and Japanese teachers to your own teacher and you. And you become another stitch in a long thread of about 90 generations so far and 2,500 years. You could think of these grandmothers and teachers as tracing a linear path along Indra's net, the Hindu and I'm tongue-tied today. I had a rough night. So the Hindu and Mahayana Buddhist metaphor in which the universe is an infinite net, the jewel at each node, each crossing, each jewel reflecting all the other jewels. It's a metaphor in which each individual node or jewel exists in relationship to the whole, in which everything is connected ultimately to everything else. Interconnection is a spiritual vision. Thich Nhat Hanh called it interbeing, but it's also a reality that contemporary science has done much to affirm and explore. Though some of this we've known all along. For example, the human body, including all of those in this room, all the so many gallons of us gathered here, is 60 to 75% water, more or less. And this water has been rain, snow, oceans, clouds, rivers, puddles, the water content of other beings, as the H2O molecules have moved ceaselessly through the world and its atmosphere and other bodies of water and bodies of flesh and plant and other beings. You are a place through which water flows, and you yourself can be conceived as a flow, as a process, rather than a solid object. After all, you are constantly taking in air, regularly taking in food and water, and your life depends on this. You're exhaling as well as inhaling, excreting, shedding while your blood is circulating. Your bone marrow is producing billions of new blood cells daily. Your body is constantly renewing itself with new cells as old cells perish and are swept away. To recognize yourself as a process rather than an object is to recognize that you are change and you are interrelationship and interdependence and interbeing. The same is true of the tall Burmese Buddha near me, carved from a single tree by an unknown artist, a tree that drew water and exchanged nutrients with other organisms in the deep darkness underground, that also reached up toward the light so that its leaves could perform the astonishing miracle of photosynthesis, of turning sunlight into the very substance that is the wood you see before you and all around you. We are all verbs pretending to be nouns, though some of us suffer from the delusion that we're nouns, or as I like to say, we're all verbs in drag as nouns. The most draggy drag of all drags, I think. So I think drag should be more fun than that delusion of solidity, and drag queens know better than that as teachers. Martin Luther King knew this when he preached, "Through our scientific and technological genius, we have made of the world a neighborhood, and yet we have not had the ethical commitment to make of it a brotherhood. Yet somehow and in some way, we have got to do this. We must all learn to live together as brothers, or we will all perish together as fools. We are tied together in the single garment of destiny, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. And whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. For some strange reason, I can never be what I ought to until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the way God's universe is made. This is the way it's structured." It's from the many speeches and sermons in which he reiterated those two phrases about the single garment of destiny, that inescapable network of mutuality, that I took this talk's title. I've been doing some writing about Martin Luther King and a lot more reading than writing. It was exciting to find out he didn't just use those phrases in the famous "I Have a Dream" speech at the Washington Monument. He used them over and over and over again from 1961 until the year of his murder. And I kind of love, first of all, that he recycled. Writers always get in trouble for that. And second of all, that he just recognized he had a good thing and made use of it. And so when I went back and read him in earnest, more than I ever had before, what filled me with delight was to find how deeply his essential message was, over and over, again and again, this way and that way, that everything is connected, and that the things that seek to divide us are an evil we must seek to overcome. Evil in their impact, untrue in their premises. He had a spiritual vision of oneness, of interbeing, and of course he was friends with Thich Nhat Hanh, which is why using that Vietnamese Buddhist neologism has special resonance here. Elsewhere he wrote, "Whether we realize that or not, each of us is eternally in the red. We're everlasting debtors to known and unknown men and women. We do not finish breakfast without being dependent on more than half the world. When we arise in the morning, we go into the bathroom, where we reach for a sponge that's provided for us by a Pacific Islander. We reach for soap created by a Frenchman. The towel is provided by a Turk. And at the table, we drink coffee that's provided for us by a South American, or tea by a Chinese, or cocoa by a West African. Before we leave for our jobs, we're beholden to more than half the world. And so he traced these threads, this sort of Indra's net of material interconnection, as he insisted again and again that we recognize the kind of moral and spiritual and emotional interconnection. He saw that we're always in community and that the failing is to recognize it, many kinds of community, and recognize that the congregation and the movement could become the beloved community he talked about over and over again, which is maybe what we hope a Sangha is, the community we talk about as one of the three treasures in Buddhism, the Buddha, the Sangha, and the Dharma. Some theologians contemplating the beloved community of King note that he aspired to change more than laws when they write, whereas desegregation can be brought about by laws, integration requires a change in attitudes. It involves personal and social relationships that are created by love, and these cannot be legislated. Integration will enlarge the concept of brotherhood to a vision of total interrelatedness. And of course, we're in a moment where they're attempting to resegregate everything, to block out histories, names, individuals, shut out entire communities, push back history on what we've achieved so far, so imperfectly, so incompletely, of Martin Luther King's dream. While some Black rights activists were separatists, King was always an integrationist. His goal was to dismantle social and racial divides and the imaginative and ethical ones, reinforcing them. He recognized, as many movements in the 1960s did not, that change had to happen on deeper levels than laws. The Martin Luther King scholar Drew Dellinger writes, as early as the Montgomery bus boycott in 1956, King said, the fact that this new age is emerging reveals something basic about the universe. It tells us something about the core and heartbeat of the cosmos. Drew writes, as I studied King's words, it also became clear that his vision was essentially one of connectedness, along with his well-known worldview of prophetic Christianity, interconnection, and interdependence were central to his thinking and consistent themes in his rhetoric. King saw reality as an interlacing network of relationships, viewed the nations and peoples of the planet as one, and linked various social injustices, saying, all these problems are tied together. So that's a bunch of stuff about interconnectedness. We're in a historical moment when the truth of interconnection, interbeing, is being denied and denounced on the most theological and practical and political levels. I wrote about that 9 years ago in the spring of 2016, when we were still in a far more stable state than we are now, in an essay called The Ideology of Isolation. I'm going to read from a little bit. I wrote, if you boil the strange soup of contemporary right-wing ideology down to a sort of bouillon cube, you find the idea that things are not connected to other things, that people are not connected to other people, and that they're all better off unconnected. The core values are individual freedom and individual responsibility, yourself for yourself on your own. Out of this glorious disconnect comes all sorts of illogical thinking. Taken to its logical or illogical conclusion, this worldview dictates that even facts are freestanding items that the self-made man can manufacture for use as he sees fit. That seemed like a radical idea in 2016. Well, in June of 2016, when this was published, it now is a terrifying reality we deal with every day, and see how much ideas shape reality. They're often dismissed as trivial, irrelevant, fluffy stuff that theologians or academics deal with, but they shape our world and they matter desperately. And the work we do with them is of utter importance and urgent importance. We are in a battle of ideas right now, the ideology of isolation against a vision of interconnection and interbeing. And we're seeing what the ideology of isolation can do all through the day, every day. in the news. This is a modern version of the ideology we still call conservative, though it's really a radical libertarianism that inverts some of the milder propositions of traditional conservative thinkers. There is no such thing as society, Margaret Thatcher said in an interview in 1987. Throughout that interview, Thatcher walked the line between old school conservatism, which said we're all connected in some way that too much government meddling might tear, and the newer version. She declared, too many children and people have been given to understand, I have a problem, it's the government's job to cope with it. And she decried that, essentially saying, we as government shouldn't help people and hope that something else will help them. And, essentially God help them, because we want to dismantle the systems of safety, of security, which were so strong in the England of that time as the national health, the national rail, and all those other systems that are in shambles now. At some point in the decades since Thatcher, the balance tipped definitively from government aid should not replace social connections to hell with others and their problems. There is, of course, such a thing as society, and you're inside it. It shapes us all, and the systems that add up to society include racism and anti-racism, economic inequality and the struggle for economic equality, prejudice. Another part of the ideology of isolation denies this systemicness, insists that each of us is his or her own responsibility, gets full credit or blame for successes or failures, is on their own with equal opportunity. And the pretense that we all have equal opportunity is the reason why they resent anything aimed at actually producing that equality. Beyond that, beneath that, above and around and within it and us, there is such a thing as ecology, the systems within which our society exists and with which it often clashes and which it's currently in so many ways destroying. Ecological thinking articulates the interdependence and interconnectedness of all things as a scientific, biological, natural reality. This can be a beautiful dream of symbiosis when you're talking about how, for example, a particular species of yucca depends on a particular moth to pollinate it, and how the larva of that moth depends on the seeds of that yucca for their first meals. Or it can be a nightmare when it comes to how toxic polychlorinated biphenyls found their way to the Arctic, where they concentrated in human breast milk, and in top of the food chain, carnivores such as polar bears. The traditional worldview could be seen as mystical or spiritual, but the accuracy of its description of natural systems within what we now call the biosphere is borne out by modern science. When we killed off all the wolves in Yellowstone, elk populations exploded and many other plant and animal species suffered, and the ecology became more reduced, more simple, more impoverished. This was a radical idea when it was actually being observed by scientists after the reintroduction of wolves about 30 years ago. And I still would have felt like I was really in the know 20 years ago when I was talking about stuff like that. My niece, who just turned 11, told me about it because she's learning it in 5th grade. And ideas are radical. And the fact that this idea traveled from scientific observation to 5th grade California public education was pretty awesome. So another interconnection nightmare, if you spray DDT or other pesticides on crops, it does what it's intended to do, more or less, of killing off the pests, but it will also, as Rachel Carson told us in her 1962 book, Silent Spring, kill the birds who might otherwise keep many insects in check, and other species will be eaten by the raptors who keep the rodents in check, and maybe keep us in check as it poisons us, gives us cancer, kills us too. Carson, like King, emerged in the middle of the last century with a transformative message that everything is connected. And this causes great trouble for the ideology of isolation. It interferes with their version of freedom, of a freedom to not be bothered by others' needs, to act in relationship with others, to recognize consequences, which is why modern conservatives so insistently deny the realities of ecological interconnectedness, refusing to recognize that when you add something or remove an element from an environment, you alter the whole in the ways that may come back to bite you. The usual argument in defense of this pesticide or that oil platform is that it is an isolated element doing something for our benefit, rather part of a far-reaching system it's harming. And sometimes, increasingly nowadays, that this far-reaching system doesn't even exist. It was really a breakthrough with Carson to start to recognize those systems. We're undergoing the great pushback of denying those systems exist, with terrible consequences for the survival of places, species, and systems now. No problem more clearly demonstrates the folly of individualist thinking or more clearly calls for a systematic response than climate change. The ideologues of isolation are doubly challenged by this fact. They reject the proposed solutions to climate change because they bristle at the need for limits on production and consumption, or rather their transformation, for regulation, for cooperation between industry and government, and for international partnerships. All those things are so antithetical to this idea of rugged individualism, of the kind of lone hero, the lone actor, the lone businessman, the unfettered capitalist. On a more fundamental level, the very idea of climate change is offensive to isolationists because it too tells us more powerfully and urgently than anything ever has that everything is connected. What comes out of your tailpipe or your smokestack or your leaky fracking site, which New Mexico has in abundance, alas. I went to see them in 2023. What comes out of those contributes to the changing mix of the atmosphere, where increasing quantities of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases cause the Earth to retain more of the heat that comes from the sun, which doesn't just result in what we used to call global warming, but leads to climate chaos that contributed to Hurricane Helene in western North Carolina last year, worsened the conditions for the devastating fires in Southern California last month, and so much else that's happening. It was so strange to get to New Mexico in February and see the Sandia Mountains with no snow on them. And by strange, I mean deeply disturbing. 30 years ago, we talked about climate change as this thing that was going to impact grandchildren. Everyone talked all the time about grandchildren, and their timeline was off. Nobody had to wait for grandchildren. It's come fast and hard. And the current administration in this country is making it much harder for the world to do things about it, although the rest of the world, or much of the rest of the world, remains committed, and the US is not the world. As the facts of climate change have become more and more difficult to deny, the ideologues of isolation deny instead our responsibility for the problem and the possibility that we're capable of acting collectively to do anything about it. They deny collective possibility as well as collective responsibility. Ultimately, they deny the science and even consequentiality, the fact that our actions have consequences. Because what keeps the ideology of isolation going is going to extremes. If you begin by denying social and ecological systems, then you end by denying the reality of facts, which are, after all, part of a network of systematic relationships among language, physical reality, and the record, regulated by the rules of evidence, truth, grammar, word meaning, and so forth. You deny the relationship between cause and effect, evidence and conclusion, or rather you imagine both as products on the free market that one can produce and consume according to one's preferences. You deregulate meaning. Absolute freedom in this version means you can have any truth that you like, and isolation's ideologues like truths that keep free market fundamentalism going. Reality in this worldview is a product subject to market rules or military rules. And if you're dominant in the marketplace or rule the empire, your reality can push aside the others. Freedom becomes just another word for nothing left to limit your options. And this is how the And this is how the ideology of isolation becomes nihilism, trying to kill the planet and most living things on it with a confidence born of total disconnection. That's more or less my 2016 essay, or part of it, back from when I was a Harper's columnist. Since then, I've learned far more, both from contemporary authoritarianism and from researching a book on George Orwell and his times about authoritarianism, which ultimately regards all other systems of authority, of knowledge of the world, as competitors to be vanquished. That includes fact, truth, history, and science, and the people, the journalists, the historians, the scientists, the educators, who deliver that vital data to us, who keep it alive, who improve it, who study it, who teach it to us. In so doing, authoritarians are endeavoring to undermine these systems of knowledge and truth so that they stand alone as the source of all information and have no hindrances as they corrupt it. It's a terrifying reality, one we can see in many ways in the world around us, and one that each of us, as I've been writing this year, can address, not through all those practical things you get told to do about politics and stuff, but just for standing on truth, that trans women are women, that climate change is real, that the Constitution is being violated, that human rights and women's rights are non-negotiable, that, what you see happening is what you see happening. You are a witness to the truth. You are a voice in what goes on. And bearing witness is one of the really powerful things we do in everyday life, in the conversations we have, and how we push back at the unreality threatening all these things. And so I encourage you all to do it, not to get into arguments with people you know, not to get into perilous situation and fights, but just to uphold the reality as you understand it. Is a really important part of what we do to preserve a democracy of ideas, where ideas are established by, these established means, not by bullying, by erasing, by taking down websites, by terrorizing. The Associated Press was told yesterday that they couldn't attend presidential press conferences unless they call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. We're seeing all kinds of really bizarre bullying going on, but this is a Dharma talk, so I'm not getting too much into the specifics of the current administration, but I also can't stay out of them entirely, as Roshi knew, and yet she invited me here. Apologies due for whatever trouble I create, although sometimes creating trouble, good trouble, as yes, yes, thank you. I didn't sleep much last night, but I also love the chorus of John Lewis here. Can we all just say John Lewis and good trouble? John Lewis, good trouble. Good trouble. Yeah, we're gonna all have to get into a lot of good trouble, and some of us are gonna find, those of us who are most vulnerable, we're in trouble just for who and what we are, which is why those of us who are more safe and secure are gonna have to get in trouble on their behalf. So, and here's this amazing passage I found in an interview with the scholar Judith Butler, who wrote a book about the power of nonviolence. They said, in my experience, the most powerful argument against violence has been grounded in the notion that when I do violence to another human being, I also do violence to myself, because my life is bound up with this other life. Most people who are formed within the liberal individualist tradition really understand themselves as bounded creatures who are radically separate from other lives. There are relational perspectives that would challenge that point of departure, and ecological perspectives as well. I don't think Judith Butler is a Buddhist, but I find it exciting that they came to this point of view from a very separate, serious study, and this recognition of non-separation, non-duality. And I should say, when I talk about the ideology of isolation, it just takes something really far that's very much part of Western culture, going back to the Greek philosophers, to the scientific method, to rationality, a kind of radical separateness that, as political philosophy, can become very toxic, as kind of bullshit science like social Darwinism can become very dangerous, as segregation can become another kind of, dangerous and ugly. So, so she's saying it's very encoded in the Western worldview, but it's not necessarily encoded at all in the Eastern worldview. And so I consider this ideology of isolation amoral, and that it thrives on the separation that licenses harm, whether to people, the non-human beings, places, or the whole earth. But I also consider it just inaccurate, whether it's merely describing the lonely world of isolated individuals or actually going to war on reality, seeking to isolate people even from their own perceptions. Maybe the most crucial sentence about totalitarianism in George Orwell's novel 1984 is, "The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command." Because again, I talked about our voices, but also our observations, our perceptions. In a way, not the isolated individual as I'm not connected, but the independent individual is like, I can observe reality for myself. And so much of what 1984 is about is an individual in rebellion against a totalitarian regime as he seeks to remember history, to feel love, to understand the world on his own terms, to develop his capacity to perceive, to remember, to understand, to relate, to question. And that also is one of the tasks we do. And it might separate us from an authority, but I think it connects us to experience itself. And perhaps Buddhist practice is training and becoming better at that. But enough about the ideology of isolation. Let's get back to the more friendly grounds of the ideology of interbeing. I obviously think it's more ethical, but I think it's also more compatible with science and even reality. This is some of the wonderful work done by the Mind and Life Institute that Roshi has been such an integral part of. They focus mostly on neuroscience, psychology, and matters of consciousness and human nature, as their name indicates. I would just add that it's likewise true in even deeper, wider ways, and the work happening now in biology and evolutionary theory over the past few decades has increasingly documented a symbiotic relational world. The old world of pseudo-Darwinist survival of the fittest, the notion of life is essentially a competitive struggle, as driven by the scarcity that capitalism believes in so devoutly, has crumbled, and in its place, we increasingly see a world of symbiosis, cooperation, interconnection, relationality, not just among humans, among animals, among plants, among lichens, among ecosystems, and ultimately among, the whole earth as a living system, a set of relationships. One of the leaders in this beautiful scientific revolution, Lynn Margulis, used to stay at Upaya, and Roshi knew her well. When I was here in November, staying in Upaya House, I can't tell you how thrilled I was, and Roshi was like, "Oh, that's the bedroom Lynn Margulis used to stay in." I'm a Lynn Margulis groupie. And Margulis went all the way down to the smallest life forms, the single-celled ones, and all the way back in time to the beginnings of the evolution of complex cells, to argue that these eukaryotic cells with a nucleus, originated from the merging of two different types of organisms, that two one-celled beings came together in the primordial oceans, and instead of devouring each other, fighting or repelling and rejecting each other, they somehow became one. They each brought their complex systems into a more complex whole. And so more complex life beyond bacteria began, that includes you and me and the baby I dandled Sunday, and the trees outside and the birds and insects in them. And began in a collaboration, in a coming together, in a liaison, not a fight. And so in a way, she argues that the very essence of life is this kind of coupling, this coming together rather than fighting and separating. She also worked with James Lovelock on the Gaia hypothesis, which recognizes the earth as a self-regulating organism, self-regulating being one definition of what it means to be alive, a very radical and controversial theory when it was first put forth in the 70s, now widely accepted. In one of the most wonderful essays I've read in a long time, 3 scientists declared in their very title, a symbiotic view of life. We have never been individuals. They traced the past 200 years of scientific ideas from individuals in competition with each other to recognizing that what was once seen as an individual is an aggregation of smaller units, cells, and then finally that these entities made up of individual cells are part of a larger cooperative whole, so that there's sort of systems existing at all these scales. And they say symbiosis is becoming a core principle of contemporary biology. And symbiosis is complementary relationships. It's mutual aid. It's, in a way, beloved community as biology. Their concluding sentence in this beautiful manifesto is, we are all lichens, meaning that like lichens, we are teams, societies, collaborations. Lichen being a collaboration between fungi and cyanobacteria or blue-green algae. Not just 2 different species, but 2 different kingdoms of life cooperating together for billions of years. In a broader way, survival that was once portrayed as an individual war of each against each is now commonly regarded as a cooperative, collaborative, complementary enterprise. Perhaps we can recognize sanghas in nature. So, and I will skip the exciting stuff about process biology because I'm getting close to time. Oh, but wait, it's too exciting. I get super excited about ideas, and I'll just quote, they say, equally central to that, and it's the idea that none of us, that the things when we describe ourselves as beings, and being is kind of wonderful because it's a verb and a noun. They essentially say we're all processes because we're constantly changing, that to be a process is to be in change. Noah's checking on the time. I'm getting close to being in trouble. And beautiful trouble, Noah, good trouble. And and they say equally central to the concept of process is the idea of change. A process depends on change for its occurrence. Being becomes a verb, an activity. This too feels very Buddhist for me. The ideology of isolation is really bad at assessing even financial realities. At the outset of Susan Simard's research that led her to describe forests as networks sharing resources and information, as communicating symbiotic communities rather than competitive individuals. At the outset, she was sent out to figure out how to grow conifers most successfully. And the forestry industry wanted the wood from the conifers. They thought the aspens were just in the way. You should eliminate the aspens. I really love indirect consequences, the way that things that are not directly and practically exploitable often have a really important role to play. And in the same way, as a political activist, I often see people say, we did something and it didn't produce immediate results, but it often produces indirect or slow consequences that matter nevertheless. And in the kind of Indra's net of interconnectedness, tracing those indirect consequences is one of the things that gives me great joy. And one of my favorite examples is in 2016, a waitress in Brooklyn got into a station wagon with some of her friends and drove to Standing Rock, where the Lakota had launched what became a huge protest led by indigenous people against the Dakota Access Pipeline going across the sacred waters of the Missouri River to bring oil to refineries. And they didn't, the simple story, the kind of ideology of isolation story is they failed, they didn't stop the pipeline. Although Native people have demonstrated such incredible patience to continue struggles for generation after generation, they continue this battle. But all these other things happened. The young woman in the station wagon was so moved by what she experienced, she decided to run for political office, helped along by a new democracy group that's spun out of the Bernie Sanders campaign, which you could also say failed because he lost, but led to all these other things, including this group that helped her run against the third most powerful person in Congress and defeat him and become somebody you've all heard of, whose name is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's making good trouble in Congress. One of our most valuable, insightful, skillful voices in this country right now. And it's because she got in that station wagon, indirect consequences. So Suzanne Samar demonstrated that aspens are a kind of indirect consequence. They contribute to the health of the whole. Even if you just want board feet, the aspens belong there, that these relationships are important, that you can't sever them without consequences. So, I think the essence of this talk is Buddhism is a very old worldview. I love that it's so aligned with these beautiful new ideas, which are often only recognitions of old truths of interbeing, interconnection, as a scientific reality, as well as a moral reality and a spiritual reality. And sometimes I think what's happening right now is that we took a detour through kind of scientific rationalism, individualism, the ideology of isolation, through this kind of ideology of separateness that came very much from the European and then the American world, the white world, the Western world. And it didn't work very well. It broke a lot of things. It alienated a lot of things. And the way that I've been told it my whole life, it's like it triumphed, Europe conquered the world, etc. But I think that those ideas are changing. And David Graeber, well, oh my God, I could digress forever, but we are definitely at time. Okay, one more thing, and Noah will just have to forgive me. In the book, The Dawn of Everything, David Graeber and David Wengross say the Enlightenment was not actually some great European ideas that came to the rest of the world, that it was actually indigenous North American ideas about equality and freedom and rights that actually came from here to Europe. And that in fact, in many ways, our values and worldviews, because those ideas were so powerful for that kind of grim, repressive, hierarchical Christian world, that we have more in common in some ways with how the Iroquois, the Jesuits, were encountering than the Jesuits of, say, 1650. So ideas and everything else continue to change. Some of the new ideas reaffirm some of the beautiful old ideas. They give us tools to understand ourselves, to understand our world, to make beautiful and good trouble, to be who we need to be, to see clearly, to stand up for what matters, and to know that it's all connected. Thank you so much. Phew.